I'm going to take you on a very fast tour of the ideas of the Baha'i vision of the world on world peace. And I'm also going to include some ideas that are from my book. So let's begin. A little bit about myself. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia in psychology and religious studies. I got a master's degree in curriculum and instruction from National University, and I did doctoral studies at Florida State University in instructional systems design. I've been a Baha'i for 42 years, since '73, and I've been in the social services career. Later I had some time in the computer business, but more recently I'm an instructional designer and a writer. So I've been pursuing a lifelong endeavor recently regarding the study of universal religion, and my book series is called The Divine Curriculum. It's actually tracking what God has been teaching humanity for approximately 4,000 years. Now, my book series is focused on the Abrahamic religion, Abrahamic lineage, but there's much more to universal religion than that. So here's a quick recap or overview of what my series is about. Volume 1, which is out, is called Divine Design. And then the great founding figures of the Abrahamic lineage are in the subsequent volumes. So volume 2, which I'm working with my publisher to bring out now, is on Abraham and Moses. Volume 3 will be on Jesus. 4 will be on Muhammad, 5 will be on the Bab, and 6 will be on Baha'u'llah. These latter two are the twin founders of the Baha'i faith, which, if we had a little time, I could explain to you how they also are part of the Abrahamic lineage. So I want to thank Professor Marquardt for inviting me here today, and also all these wonderful other departments and agencies of the college. So I want to thank everybody for having me here. Okay. So the place to begin is that the vision of world peace, the teachings about world peace, they emanate from the teachings of Baha'u'llah, who is the founder of the Baha'i faith. His name means the glory of God. And the approach that Baha'u'llah provides is both practical and spiritual in nature. And he addresses questions about the nature of God, God's plans and purposes for humanity, the purpose of religion, really the nature of human nature, and practical measures to bring about peace. Now, there's a considerable body of knowledge that exists within the Baha'i faith on the subject of peace. Our primary source materials are the writings of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, the Universal House of Justice, as well as the writings of numerous scholars. Now, the first three names are the central founding figures of the Baha'i faith. The Bab was the forerunner, Baha'u'llah was the prophet founder, Abdul Baha was the son of the founder, Shoghi Effendi was the head of the faith after the passing of Abdul Baha, and then the Universal House of Justice is the world governing body of the Baha'i faith. We don't have any clergy, we have elected institutions, and the Universal House of Justice is the body that governs the Baha'i world. Now, in 1985, the Universal House of Justice came out with a marvelous statement called the Promise of World Peace. This was a landmark statement on the subject of peace, and we will be spending quite a bit of time with it today. But to really understand the subject in a full way, we have to begin with our concept of God. And basically in the Baha'i faith, the concept of God is that God is completely infinite, utterly transcendent, eternal. And of course, we're strictly monotheistic in our teachings. We think of God as beyond all boundaries of space and time, and he's not corporeal. We use the word he because English doesn't provide a word that's suitable for God. But, and so he's beyond space and time. And now here's a quote from Baha'u'llah in his own writings where he addresses the lofty station of God. Lauded and glorified art thou, O Lord my God. How can I make mention of thee? Assured as I am that no tongue, however deep its wisdom, can befittingly magnify thy name. nor can the bird of the human heart, however great its longing, ever hope to ascend into the heaven of thy majesty and knowledge. And now here's another one I want to share with you. All that the sages and mystics have said or written have never exceeded, nor can they ever hope to exceed, the limitations to which man's finite mind hath been strictly subjected. To whatever heights the mind of the most exalted of men may soar, such mind and heart can never transcend that which is the creature of their own conceptions and the product of their own knowledge. So just very quickly, what this is telling us is that no matter how enlightened a person may be, a regular human being, no matter how enlightened you may be, and no matter how spiritually illuminated your heart may be, and no matter how great your mystical experiences might have been, there is a certain limit to what humans are capable of with regard to understanding the infinite God. Everything that you know or feel or would be able to understand is essentially going to remain with you at the human level of existence. God is infinitely beyond that. So now, in the Baha'i writings, we're taught that God has created humanity with a purpose. And so this is a very important quote. It's one of the most important quotes we find in the Baha'i writings. Baha'u'llah says, having created the world and all that liveth and moveth therein, he, through the direct operation of his unconstrained and sovereign will, chose to confer upon man the unique distinction and capacity to know him and to love him, a capacity that must needs be regarded as a generating impulse and primary purpose underlying the whole of creation. Now we have other quotes as well. Thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. And then also, all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. So in brief, God has given to humanity basically 5 things. An immortal soul that gives us the power of the mind and the heart. And we have a mission, according to these various quotes, of knowing God, of loving God, choosing God, and carrying forward an ever-advancing civilization. Man's fundamental nature, man's true reality is spiritual. As their writings say, man, the true man, is soul and not body. These concepts are important in order to help us understand how God, the vision of world peace will come into the picture. You'll see it very shortly. So human beings are imperfect. We're flawed. We are dependent on God. We are in need of education. But the Baha'i teachings say that humanity is inherently good. No matter what our troubles may be, no matter what the difficulties there may exist among peoples and nations of the world, human beings are fundamentally good at the essence of what their reality may be. Now, Baha'i faith also says that human beings are destined to evolve and to prosper, to achieve full maturity, the whole human race, and to attain unto both material and divine civilization. And Baha'i teachings also say, consistent with the teachings of, say, the Old Testament or the New Testament, that God is very active in human history. He's not passive or he's not indifferent to human history. And out of his pure grace, because he doesn't actually need us, to help humanity to achieve its preordained and extremely exalted destiny. So we've been created for something really wonderful that we're still learning about. Now, in the Baha'i writings, we are taught that the full measure of our human destiny is beyond the imagining of anybody living today. But it begins with elevating humankind to the level of the kingdom of God on earth, which is the promised divine civilization, what Baha'u'llah calls to the all-glorious paradise. And it is the practical aim of the Baha'i faith to help mankind to achieve this state. And so this state only comes about through the divine educators and the divine curriculum which they bring. The Baha'is teachings say that God is both unknowable and wishing to be known. So he sends periodically his educators into the timeline of history. So who are they? Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab and Baha'u'llah are the figures in the Abrahamic lineage. And then, of course, we mustn't forget Krishna, Buddha, Zoroaster, and maybe there are many other figures in history. Actually, the Baha'i writings say that the number of times that God has sent a messenger into the world, a divine educator, is innumerable, but we have not been able to hold onto all of them in humanity's historical records. These are just the names we know about. And they're like a spiritual sunrise, these great figures, when they show up on the timeline of history. So here's a graphic from my book where I show many of the names and their periods in history and the religions they gave birth to, their scriptures, where they came from, and the part of the world where their influence is felt mostly today. So that's in the handout, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just wanted you to see it. It's very, very interesting when you put the divine educators on the timeline of history. This is kind of what you see. So Krishna was about 3100 BC, so that's about 5100 years ago. And then Abraham was approximately 4,000 years ago. Moses was in between, and then Zoroaster was about 1000 BC, and then Buddha and Jesus, Muhammad. And then for the first time in history, we got two divine messengers in the same century. Until that has never happened before, but it's now happened. But you see that they're spaced out approximately every 500 to 1,000 years. Now, the Baha'i teachings say that these great figures were truly divine messengers. They were all sent by God. And we have this marvelous quote from the Baha'i writings. The holy manifestations who founded the religious systems are united and agreed. There is no differentiation possible in their mission and teachings. All are promulgators of the religion of God. So for the purpose, I don't know what you believe or what your personal religious backgrounds may be, but for the purpose of this discussion today, what we're saying is that all of these messengers, all of these divine educators were sent from the same one God, and they're all on the same mission. But because they appear in the timeline of history at different times, they're involved with different stages of that universal mission. So, for 6,000 years, the divine educators have been teaching humanity how to live according to God's way, following his will, and conquering the selfish side of human nature. Human nature, we are told, is not evil, but it does have a dual aspect. There's a material side, and then there's a spiritual side. But most importantly, God decided to create us. He could have done anything he wanted. He, all-powerful, infinite being, creator of the universe, he could do whatever he wanted with us. But he chose to give us free will. This is like our human birthright. So what we're supposed to do with our free will is not to rebel or to hurt one another, but we're supposed to learn how to master the material side with the angelic side of our human nature, to place the spiritual side of our humanity in control. Now, the evil that people do is a result of when they do the opposite, when they allow the material side to be stronger than the spiritual side. This creates all sorts of characteristics. People become selfish, egotistical, cruel, unjust, unfaithful, envious, dishonest, corrupt, and the list goes on. Now, on the other side, the angelic side of humanity represents virtue, things like truth, faith, love, forgiveness, fellowship, justice, unity, and peace. And again, that list could be much longer. Now, Abdu'l-Baha, one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, has made this really important statement. In every dispensation, the light of divine guidance has been focused upon one central theme. And so here's a little graphic to kind of give you the progression, but we're going to go into it just a little bit more detail in just a second. Now, once again, these are on the timeline of history. And in the Baha'i writings, the previous 6,000 years of history is referred to the Adamic cycle because it begins with Adam. And so roughly 6,000 years ago, a period of history began where divine messengers were being sent. And that cycle, the Adamic cycle, ended 172 years ago. And a new cycle began. But before we go into the new cycle, let's review the curriculum, the teachings that each of the divine messengers has brought to humanity. So with the story of Adam and Eve, it's obviously in many parts of it are metaphorical, but certain things are featured in the story: human conscience, individuality, intellect, the birth of sin, the existence of the soul, accountability, good versus evil. Abraham was crucially involved in establishing the oneness of God and the sacredness of human life. He vehemently fought against idolatry in his time, and he established the covenant relationship between man and God. Now, when Moses appears, he takes what Abraham taught and he adds to it the law of God. He said he was from the God of Abraham, but he introduced to his people in his time the law of God. And he emphasized further the oneness of God and also the covenant and ethical monotheism. And he continued his fight against idolatry. Now, when Jesus appears, he admits and agrees with all that has been brought before. And these previous figures of Abraham and Moses, he honors them in his words. But then he adds to their teachings the emphasis of the law, the love of God and fellow man. He proclaims the coming of the kingdom. He establishes an understanding of the afterlife. And he makes very, very important for all of the believers the issue of salvation. And he brings forth the quickening power of the Holy Spirit. These are just highlights of what were each in these revelations. Now, Muhammad emphasized many of the same things, but the key theme that was in his revelation was submission to the will of God. In fact, the word Islam, it means submission to God's will. And a Muslim, what that word means is one who submits to God's will. That's what it's supposed to mean. Now, in the 19th century, when the Bab appeared, he taught that the beauty of God was reflected in all things. He taught an idea about the sanctuary of the heart and the perspective of unity, seeing the unity of God in all of creation. And he taught also teachings about progressive revelation and attaining spiritual perfection. And he foretold the coming of the promised one. And that figure was Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah's emphasis is on the oneness of humanity. Baha'u'llah teaches all these other things as well, but this is where the emphasis was placed. So, if you look at all that, for the last 6,000 years, would you agree that that's a fairly complete curriculum, a process of spiritual education? Lots of overlap, lots of commonality, certain areas of differences from one religion to the next. But overall, that fast trip through 6,000 years of divine curriculum, if you did all these things, would you think that would your spiritual education be relatively complete? What do you think? Yeah? So these lessons are intended for all of humanity. So in 6,000 years, we've had lessons on knowing God, obeying God, loving God, submitting to God, reflecting God, and having unity of the human race. And so if we followed all these ideas, starting from the very beginning to the present day, wouldn't these lessons, if we followed them, give us divine civilization? Wouldn't human society attain unto world peace? So this is what the curriculum has been for 6,000 years. They're all connected with each other and all building on what has been brought before. So I'm making a claim here based on Baha'i teachings. First of all, I'm saying that the divine educators for the last 6,000 years have been on one mission from one God. It's all the same mission, but at different stages in human history. And the purpose of this mission has been to prepare humanity for the great age when world peace, universal salvation, and divine civilization will finally be established. Now, I also make the additional claim that the Baha'i faith says that this age has come. The time in human history to establish world peace is actually now. The 1,000-year period that we're living in now, until God sends another messenger. In that time of history, this is when the most great peace, or the great peace of humanity, will come. And that is synonymous with the kingdom of God on earth and the all-glorious paradise. Now, I showed you this graphic earlier, the 6,000-year Adamic cycle. And so roughly speaking, there it is. Baha'u'llah tells us that humanity has entered into a new cycle, a new major period of history. And it's referred to as the cycle of fulfillment. So Baha'u'llah is the first of the divine messengers in this period of history. But there'll be many more. Nobody knows how many, so I could have drawn many, but I didn't want to clutter the screen. Now, the great peace that I'm talking about gets accomplished during this 1,000-year period. And really, the great peace that we're talking about, this vision of world peace, is really just the gateway or the doorway for once humanity has established peace, that is when we get to find out truly the destiny that God has in store for us. All of this is preparation for, and we're told that this period, this fulfillment cycle, is destined to last for no less than 500,000 years. So that's a staggering number. It's a tremendous suggestion of what the destiny of humanity is. But implicit in this is the promise that humanity is going to continue and thrive and prosper through this whole time. Now, those previous graphics were not to scale. I want to give you a sense of the greatness of this vision. I actually put 500,000 years on a 12-inch scale. And so this period right here is all of recorded history so far. And this is where we are in history, and the Baba and Baha'u'llah are here. We're right at this transition point. And all of the future of human history is yet to come. This period represents just 1.2% of the total of what has been laid out for us in the sacred writings. So this is a staggering concept. Now, after I've laid that on you, I just want to say a couple of things. Obviously, these are extraordinary claims. No one should believe in them without due consideration and examination. And at the same time, we hope that no one will reject them without also due consideration. And so I only have a short amount of time today to provide these ideas for you. So all I can do is give you the highlights. To actually prove it, to establish it, would require further investigation. Also, these are bold claims even within the Baha'i Faith's writings. So here's a passage from Shugh Effendi. A solemn assertion that attainment to this final stage in this stupendous evolution is not only necessary but inevitable, that its realization is fast approaching, and that nothing short of a power that is born of God can succeed in establishing it. So men of goodwill can try, but ultimately this only can happen if God assists humanity. So here's a quick summary. These are the points that have been highlighted so far. There's just one creator God. The divine educators were all from the same source. The divine educators were all on the same mission, different stages of it. They all taught vital parts of the divine curriculum. Nothing is to be taken for granted. That curriculum aimed at advancing civilization, accomplishing salvation, and mastery of the animal side by the angelic side of human nature, which is fundamentally good in its essence. And that humanity is now at the stage of its coming of age. Great peace for the first time in human history is actually attainable. Now, I've talked about this 1,000-year period that Baha'i Faith says that we are in. And Baha'u'llah does not describe the emergence of world peace as some sort of a sudden, miraculous event. He says that this will come in stages. Remember, he gave us free will, so we have to learn our way into this according to divine guidance. But what we can do, we human beings today, right now, we can make world peace come faster or slower by the things that we do, with more suffering or less suffering by the things that we do. So actually, the fate of humanity really does depend on what we do today. And so with that, all of that religious context and setting forth the pattern of human history so far brings us to the point where we can now discuss the statement of the Universal House of Justice, the promise of world peace. Now, it's very, very interesting. When the Universal House of Justice came out with this in 1985, I had been a Baha'i for some time, and I was very impressed with his writing. I felt like all those years I thought I knew a lot about the faith. Reading that document, I felt like, wow, I'm only really understanding it for the first time. So this was a momentous document. And the Baha'is engaged in a worldwide effort to bring this statement to the leaders of the world. So we had presented it to the United Nations, to the President of Austria, that's the Dalai Lama in that picture. He's a much younger man, but to him in Tibet, and to the Prime Minister, or the President of India. And in fact, we went to 198 heads of state. The statement has been translated into 76 languages, and more than 2 million people, it's been disseminated to more than 2 million people over the years. We were even able to get a presentation with President Reagan, who was president in 1985. In addition to that, there followed, in academic and scholarly circles, there followed some interest in the peace statement, and the Baha'i Chair for World Peace was founded at the University of Maryland. I believe that came along in 1993. And on the left, you see Dr. Bashrui, who is the first to hold the seat, and then the current occupant, Dr. Mahmoudi, is in the image on the right. So there's a lot of academic interest in the statement on world peace as well. And so the statement on world peace begins with an awesome assertion. Basically, whether or not we have world peace is a choice to be made by the human race, and especially the world leaders. So here's a quote for you. The great peace towards which people of goodwill throughout the centuries have inclined their hearts, of which seers and poets for countless generations have expressed their vision, and for which from age to age the sacred scriptures of mankind have constantly held the promise, is now at long last within the reach of the nations. World peace is not only possible, but inevitable. It is the next stage in the evolution of the planet. Whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced now by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. So this is actually a choice that we human beings must make. Now, God could have made, with a metaphorical snap of the fingers, God could have made a perfect world right from the start. He could have done that with his infinite power, but he chose to create a world where we would be participants using our free will, learning how to use our free will. And we have a crucial part to play. So this statement discusses positive indications that peace is attainable, and then it also mentions certain barriers. Now, the foremost barrier to world peace is a widespread belief about human nature. They write, uncritical assent is given to the proposition that human beings are incorrigibly selfish and aggressive, and thus incapable of erecting a social system at once progressive and peaceful, dynamic and harmonious, a system giving free play to individual creativity and initiative, but based on cooperation and reciprocity. Now, I did a quick went over to the dictionary.com, and I wanted to get a definition of the word incorrigible, just so there'd be no confusion for anybody. And this is what stuck out for me: bad beyond correction or reform. So the belief that human beings are incorrigible, that we are bad beyond correction, impervious to constraints, firmly fixed, not easily changed, not easily swayed or influenced. So this is what the word incorrigible means. So what this produces is a paralyzing contradiction in human affairs. People declare, on the one hand, their readiness and their longing for peace, and at the same time they declare it, or they assert that it is impossible. This fundamental contradiction, which hinders its realization, demands a reassessment, and it represents a distortion of the human spirit. When this idea is corrected, it will enable all people to set in motion constructive social forces, which, because they are consistent with human nature, will encourage harmony and cooperation instead of war and conflict. So what we're starting to see here is the Universal House of Justice is explaining that fundamentally one of the greatest barriers to world peace is the problem of attitude. How do we conceive of one another? Do we conceive of each other as incorrigibly bad? Or do we see in one another as human beings the potential for goodness? And the consequences of this contradiction are profound. The House of Justice wrote, "The perversion of human nature, the degradation of human conduct, the corruption and dissolution of human institutions reveal themselves in their worst and most revolting aspects. Human character is debased, confidence is shaken, the nerves of discipline are relaxed, the voice of human conscience is stilled. The sense of decency and shame is obscured. Conceptions of duty, of solidarity, of reciprocity and loyalty are distorted, and the very feeling of peacefulness, of joy and hope is gradually extinguished." We also observe this deterioration that takes place in international politics. So when, like colonialism, when nations exploit one another for resources and all sorts of things, when nations interact with other nations, not based upon the common good of humanity, but based upon perceived selfish interest, or when there's a constant attitude of rivalry and hostility rather than friendship and cooperation, when nations seek to hold themselves as superior to other nations. So no one denies that there's dishonesty, cruelty, injustice, and corruption in the world by both individuals and nations. The question is whether the situation is bad beyond reform. And the Baha'i Faith says that the situation truly is severe in the world today, but human race is not incorrigible. The Baha'i Faith asserts that human beings are not inherently bad. Education, especially spiritual education, can set right human nature. So religion has played a lamentable role in our time. There's been distortions and misleading interpretations by religious leaders. There's been the rise of militant religious fanaticism, and then there's the failure of many religious institutions to embody the ideals they espouse or to avoid corruption. Here's another quote. "Had humanity seen the educators of its collective childhood in their true character as agents of one civilizing process, it would no doubt have reaped incalculably greater benefits from the cumulative effects of their successive missions. This, alas, it failed to do." And on the secular side, what the House of Justice refers to as the substitute faiths, whether it's materialism or capitalism or socialism, social and economic ills blight every region in the planet. Tremendous spiritual damage and disillusionment has taken place. And the statement goes on, it points out that banning nuclear weapons or prohibiting the use of poison gases, outlawing germ warfare, that does not in itself remove the causes of war. However important such practical measures are as elements of peace, they are in themselves too superficial. A genuine universal framework must be adopted. Do you see how we're starting to talk about how human consciousness needs to go through a radical change? But this contradiction that we've been talking about produces a paralysis of will. This paralysis is rooted, as we have stated, in a deep-seated conviction of the inevitable quarrelsomeness of mankind that has led to the reluctance to even entertain the possibility of subordinating national self-interest to the requirements of world order. So then, the statement from the Universal House of Justice goes into some detail now. And they mention a list of urgent issues facing humanity that must be addressed and must be considered as prerequisites to world peace. And so I'm going to just list them here for you. And if you want to talk about them more during the Q&A period, we can do that. Obviously, it's so clear, we must have a healing of racism in the world. There is serious problems going on in the world with the inordinate disparity between rich and poor. Unbridled nationalism has been a blight upon humanity. Religious strife, of course, is major. The emancipation of women. Now that's so interesting because the emancipation of women is not normally associated as being a prerequisite of world peace, but the Baha'i writings are very explicit that this is one of the most important, though less acknowledged, prerequisites of peace. And then, continuing the list, the cause of universal education. World peace is unattainable when you have large portions of humanity sunk in ignorance. So everybody must be educated. And then there's a need for communication amongst all the peoples of the world. The fundamental lack of communication creates all sorts of problems. So the Baha'i faith encourages the peoples of the world. One day we will adopt an international auxiliary language, keeping our mother tongues, because that's the repository of our culture, our ethnicity, and all those wonderful traits. But we need to have a second language, a universal auxiliary language, so that any person can go anywhere and be understood by anyone, anywhere on the planet. These are just some of the most relevant issues facing the world on the matter of world peace. Now, the statement further explains that the abolition of war does not consist solely of just signing treaties and protocols. Peace is very complex. It requires a new level of commitment to resolving issues that are not customarily associated with peace. We must raise peace amongst mankind to the level of principle. And here's a really important statement about principle. There are spiritual principles by which solutions can be found for every social problem. The essential merit of spiritual principle is that it not only presents a perspective which harmonizes with that which is immanent in human nature, it also induces an attitude, a dynamic, a will, an aspiration, which facilitate the discovery and implementation of practical measures. Leaders of government and all in authority would be well served in their efforts to solve problems if they would first seek to identify the principles involved and be guided by them. So certainly there's a place in the matters of world peace for pragmatism. But ultimately, to get to the core and underlying root of problems, we have to address the issue of peace at the level of principle. And whatever the problem is that we're discussing in the world today, the best way to approach finding a solution is to raise it to the level of principle. And in addition to doing that, what it does is it induces a new attitude, a new commitment, a will to act, which will overcome this paralyzing contradiction that we were talking about earlier. So the Baha'i faith mentions other vital issues. The statement, mentions other issues. One of them is establishing a system of world governance by universal agreement. So the Baha'i faith recommends a world federation. And I'm going to depart from the peace statement for just a moment to refer to another book in the Baha'i writings called The World Order of Baha'u'llah. And in this passage, Shoghi Effendi is telling of an encounter that Abdul Baha had when he traveled across the United States in this country. And it's a really, really interesting passage. You can best serve your country, was Abdul Baha's rejoinder to a high official in the service of the federal government of the United States of America, who had questioned him as to the best manner in which he could promote the interests of his government and people. So you see right there, the person who's asking the question is just thinking about his own national interest. Do you see that clearly? So Abdul Baha replies, you can best serve your country if you strive in your capacity as a citizen of the world. See how he's trying to change his perspective? To assist in the eventual application of the principle of federalism underlying the government of your own country to the relationships now existing between the peoples and nations of the world. So this is not something the Baha'is have any intention of forcing upon the peoples of the world. We're not into that at all. But we believe that where humanity must go eventually is to establish something on the order of a federation of nations, a world commonwealth, if you like. So back to the peace statement. The statement mentions other vital issues, that eventually humanity must address the question of demilitarization of the planet and the principle of collective security so that no nation can be threatened by another, because all of the nations of the world will come to its protection. You know, this principle of collective security already exists in many of our legal institutions, in NATO and the United Nations. There's already clauses in the charter documents that make the provision that if any one of the members comes under attack, the others will come to its assistance. So this is already a concept that humanity is beginning to embrace. And so eventually we're talking about the reconstruction of the whole of human society. So the fundamental concept that will make all of this work properly is the principle of the oneness of humankind. And so we have this quote: "World order can be founded only on an unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind, a spiritual truth which all of the human sciences confirm. Recognition of this truth requires abandonment of prejudice of every kind: race, class, color, creed, nation, sex, degree of material civilization, everything which enables people to consider themselves superior to others. Acceptance of the oneness of mankind is the first fundamental prerequisite for reorganization and administration of the world as one country, the home of mankind. Universal acceptance of this spiritual principle is essential to any successful attempt to establish world peace. It should therefore be universally proclaimed, taught in schools, and constantly asserted in every nation as preparation for the organic change in the structure of society." I'm going to skip this quote. Well, actually, this is a really good one. "A vision transcending the cessation of war and the creation of agencies. Permanent peace among the nations is an essential stage, but not, Baha'u'llah asserts, the ultimate goal of the social development of humanity. Beyond the initial armistice, beyond pragmatic arrangements for security and coexistence, beyond even the many experiments and cooperation which these steps will make possible, lies the crowning goal, the unification of all of the peoples of the world in one universal family." So this statement lists many details about the process of building world peace and arousing the necessary volition to act. It calls for the imperative necessity of the peoples, the leaders of the world, gathering together in an embracing assemblage. And it offers the Baha'i world as a community, 5 million followers of tremendous diversity, as a possible model of international fellowship. And now here's some quotes about disunity. I'm going to jump to the middle here. It says, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established." Okay. "The virtues that befit human dignity are trustworthiness, forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness towards all peoples. We affirm the belief that the potentialities inherent in the station of man, the full measure of his destiny on earth, the innate excellence of his reality, must all be manifested in this promised day of God. These are the motivations for unshakable faith that unity and peace are the attainable goal towards which humanity is striving." Okay, so I'm going to make one more word in conclusion that's not mentioned in the statement. The Baha'i teachings affirm that world peace is a lengthy process among the nations, requiring centuries, unfolding in stages. Now, in the 19th century, when the Baha'i revelation was first brought into the world, the condition of the world was primarily colonialism and absolute monarchy. And so people were not free by any measure of freedom. And then in the 20th century, we had a period of nation building, casting off of colonialism, and nations becoming independent. Towards the end of the 20th century, we got what we call the unity of nations. This is a specific term in the Baha'i writings, and it refers to the fact that whether we like each other or not, or whether we're at war with one another or not, we all recognize that everywhere on the planet we're all one human race. And so this is an important transition in human consciousness, which has already occurred. Stages yet to come. The lesser peace, which is considered to be like the political peace of the planet. And it is not established by the Baha'is, but it's established by the nations and peoples of the world themselves. And then eventually, the most great peace towards the latter part of the 1,000-year period that we're talking about has to do with the complete spiritualization of the people and nations of the world. So all of this is going to be accomplished in this 1,000-year period. Humanity will survive and thrive for at least 500,000 years. And the Baha'i vision of world peace is comprehensive, universal, inclusive, community-based. Peace is also the fulfillment of prophecy. It is attainable, it's necessary, it's inevitable. It is actually fast approaching, and it's closer than we imagine. And most importantly, every individual and every nation has an urgent and vital part to play in hastening its appearance. So here's a final quote from Baha'u'llah. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. So that was a really fast tour. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm here, really, my name is Kathy Benton, I teach in the religion department, many of you already know that. And I'm happy to take any questions to help sort of moderate a conversation here. Questions?
Yes, I'm just curious, what religion did you convert to Baha'i from?
That's interesting. The back of my book says Edward Price is a former atheist from a Jewish background who became a Baha'i. That's, yeah. So when I was growing up, I was raised from a Jewish family, but we were not, greatly religious, and Judaism was not really something I didn't relate well to it at that stage of my life. And on the day of my bar mitzvah, I decided I didn't really want to have anything more to do with it, which is ironic because that's supposed to be your initiation day. But anyway, for those next 5 years, I was very strong atheist, argumentative type, that kind of person. And I encountered the Baha'i faith in college at the University of Virginia. And my Baha'i friend, her name was Mary, she was way smarter than me. And I had to deal with that. And she answered me many questions that I didn't even know I had. And over a period of months, less than a year, I realized that the message of Baha'u'llah was something I truly believed in. And since September 1973, I've been a Baha'i. That's the short version. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Or comments? Thoughts?
You're thinking of something. I can see it.
Yeah, in my class, they say you have to be careful not to scratch your head or anything at this point, because I'll think that you're reading.
I know there's a Baha'i temple in Mecca. How many are there around the world?
Actually, it's in Wilmette, just a little further south. That's right. But there are 7, or actually there's one temple just about to be dedicated. So I should say there's 8 in the world today. But there's 5 more that are being planned and built at the present time in different parts of the world. Right now, we have one on every continent.
Where's the new one?
Santiago, Chile. Yeah, very pretty. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna ask, so with the religion, kind of acknowledging all the other prominent Abrahamic and even some of the other religions across the world, is the Baha'i religion viewed any differently by other religions? Are they ostracized or more so accepted?
Well, we have a huge problem in the Islamic world. The faith was born in the 19th century in Persia, which is Iran today. And almost from day one, really horrible persecutions ensued. The clergy in Persia, even in the 19th century, was very reactionary and a little bit power controlling, you know what I'm talking about. And they repressed the movement right away. The Bab himself was martyred. Over 20,000 of the early followers were slaughtered. And to this day, Baha'is are imprisoned on nothing, for no reason whatsoever. We're denied education. They're wearing a t-shirt about that. But systematically repressed in every way that they can. Their thinking is that Islam teaches, according to their view of Islam, that Muhammad was the last messenger. So the Bab and Baha'u'llah coming after Muhammad must, by definition, regardless of what they said, be false. And so that's an object of hatred for them. It's tragic, but that's the way it is. Yeah.
There are a variety of approaches to achieving world peace.
Absolutely.
Some more secular and economic than others. So it's long been argued, for example, that capitalist markets, if extended worldwide, would encourage peaceful relations between people. And that's, of course, built on a more self-interested model of human interaction. What's the Baha'i reaction to that sort of vision? Is that sort of maybe a stage on the way, or is it somehow fundamentally contrary to the Baha'i approach?
Well, the peace statement actually uses the word capitalism in it, which I went by really fast. You might know it. Did you catch it?
I noticed it, but
Okay.
it seemed to be more
Well,
complaint about it.
it was a complaint,
Yeah.
because the fundamental characteristic of capitalism is its materialism interpretation of human reality. So if human beings are just consumers or producers, or brokers between the consumers and you know what I'm saying. If that's all human reality is, it's, from the Baha'i point of view, fundamentally flawed, because it negates or ignores or even rejects the true reality of man, which is spiritual. So while there might be advantageous characteristics to market economies, left to their extremes, they produce another problem, which is the inordinate disparity between rich and poor. So the Baha'i Faith's outlook on the prevailing systems of the world, whether it's capitalism or socialism, is that none of them are perfect, because most of them are fundamentally materialistic in their philosophical outlook, attitude towards human nature. So Baha'u'llah actually states that the economic problems of the world are fundamentally spiritual at the core. You could pick any economic problem going on in the world. If you analyze it to its causal factors, it's something of a spiritual problem, whether it's greed or dishonesty or corruption, whatever it may be. Spending more than you have, deficit spending, it could be anything. So it's fundamentally spiritual problem to solve the economy, to any of the world systems. So while there might be good things about certain aspects of capitalism, a Baha'i shouldn't say I'm a capitalist, or a Baha'i shouldn't say I'm a socialist, because those are fundamentally materialistic in their orientation. Make sense? Yeah.
So, at a world, let me just, you stop me, maybe this, if I'm going off the wrong direction, but world peace will be brought about by the transformation of humankind, will be realizing the ideals that were brought forward. Is this transformation in Baha'i religion done intellectually? Is it done through study? Or is it done in some religions what you might call through the grace of God and prayer and worship?
All of the above. We wouldn't make an artificial distinction. As complete human beings, obviously we need to use our intellect. But at the same time, we must use our heart as well in order to be able to acquire the capacity to see and interact on the basis of the oneness of humankind. If I just intellectually believe, like an abstract concept, that mankind is one, there's not necessarily any reason why that abstract idea would change my behavior or alter my deep-seated feelings about the people I come into contact with, or even nations with other nations. So it's heart and mind together. So there's plenty of room to understand the receiving of divine grace. And there's plenty of room for the hard work of using our human mind to solve the real problems of the world. They go hand in hand. One should not see them in conflict. And just as a side note, one of the central Baha'i teachings is that the religion and science must go in harmony together. That true science and true religion, each of them properly understood, are not in conflict.
Maybe one last question or comment?
Please. Can you talk a bit about the significance of Baha'i temples? Because I mean, there's only a few of them. Are they
Well, 8 of them in the world now.
in the world?
Yeah, Baha'u'llah says as the Baha'i community grows, one day, in the distant future, there'll be one in every city. But right now, resources, the Baha'i faith is about 5 million followers in the world. We have had the means so far to produce 8, and there's 5 more in progress.
Can you say a little bit about like,
Yes, I
the
did.
layout of the
Yes.
temple?
Yes. The temple is actually called, in the writings of Baha'u'llah, the dying place of the praise of God. And it's unlike a church, or a synagogue, or a mosque, because it's not a congregational building. One of the most important things I get you to understand is to just come and visit, because really the Baha'is have built the temple as a gift for all of humanity. So everyone is welcome regardless of your religious point of view, or even if you have no religion at all. It doesn't matter to us. We just want, as long as people come in peace, we're very happy to have you come, enjoy the gardens, enjoy the inner place in the auditorium, where it's so very beautiful, come to any of our programs. Everyone is welcome. But the concept of the house of worship is really interesting, because Baha'u'llah said that as it's actually an institution of the faith, and as this institution develops, there will be social and humanitarian institutions that are built up in affiliation with the temple. So there will be hospitals and orphanages and different places of various types of social services. And there'll be like service to mankind will be coupled with worship of God. So the two things will go hand in hand together. And that's the longer term vision of what the temples are about. But obviously those things can only be realized as gradually the means to do so become available.
And you might talk about how temples are funded.
Oh, yes. Well, the Baha'i faith itself is funded only by contributions from Baha'is. So people have tried who were not members to, make donations large and small, actually. And we have to say no thank you, because it's part of our belief that only a Baha'i person who has enrolled in the faith has the privilege of contributing and supporting the activities of the faith. So it's totally Baha'i supported, individual contributions. And we also don't have any practice in the faith. It's actually forbidden to kind of single an individual out, say, I noticed you didn't give last month. We don't do that. We don't have any kind of peer pressure. We don't pass the plate. Giving to the fund is a spiritual obligation, but it's one that you manage yourself between you and God. So it's private and it's confidential. And yeah.
Thank you, Edward Price, for explaining the Baha'i vision of world peace.
Yeah, I wish it takes, it's so much to it, that it was a fast tour.
Thank you for the fast tour.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.